Hello, reading friend, and thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend some time with Shakespeare in a Divided America. What his plays tell us about our past and future by James Shapiro. This book was originally published in 2020, and I listened to a Penguin Random House audio edition, which was also published in 2020. So, Shakespeare in a Divided America. I wanted to read this because I'm interested in, I love books about books. In this case, it's a book about a play, about plays, but nevertheless, it really piqued my interest. And I also really like these sort of cultural histories and how it really interested me to learn a bit how Shakespeare's plays have sort of interacted with American culture throughout history. So the way this book is structured is there's an introduction, there's 7 chapters, and then there's a conclusion. So the best way to approach this, I think, is just to go sort of chapter by chapter and sort of hit the high points of what I took away as sort of really interesting and surprising, maybe in some cases, from that chapter. So it starts with the introduction. So the introduction kicks off sort of talking about this Julius Caesar production from 2017. And this Julius Caesar production was in Central Park in New York in a theater. I can't think of the name of the theater. I should have written it down. But the name of the production was of Julius Caesar, had the Caesar sort of looking like Donald Trump. And this caused a lot of controversy at the time. Really a firestorm of controversy at the time. And he talks a bit more about it in the conclusion, so I'll discuss it a bit more then. But he also talks here in the introduction about who can play in a Shakespeare play, and who is able to act in a Shakespeare play is who's considered to be an American. And here, we talk about African Americans. So in Othello, there's an African character, Othello himself, who describes himself as African, he describes himself as black. And yet African Americans were not allowed to play Othello until Paul Robeson played Othello in 1943 on Broadway. So I thought that was just really interesting. And then there's also talks about the schoolboy Hamlet. And I did not write this author's name down, but it's a Japanese author from the 1940s who wrote this story, or this essay, I guess, called The Schoolboy Hamlet, who, he's really describing in this story, he can't be Hamlet. So in a school production of Hamlet, for example, he could never be cast as Hamlet, because at that time that would have not ever happened, because so I thought that was really interesting. Then chapter 1 is called Miscegenation from 1833. And here Othello again. Othello might be the play that's mentioned most in this book, because in the U.S., with its long history of slavery and racism, Othello with its black Othello married to white Desdemona has reverberated through the culture, the whole history basically. But so Othello, here, the interesting thing I took away was John Quincy Adams himself said Desdemona, who gets murdered by Othello in the play due to jealousy, that Desdemona got what she deserved because she had violated the natural laws of, race mixing. I was shocked by that, because John Quincy Adams is known as a abolitionist. And so I just was really surprised to hear that. But nevertheless, there it is. But miscegenation, yeah. So then chapter 2 is 1845, Manifest Destiny. This is when the country was starting to expand further westward. and started out with this Texas Revolution. The United States went into Texas and ultimately had a war with Mexico and got a whole bunch of territory, expanding the country all the way to the west. And so during this time in Texas, there was this military base. And this military base was going to put on a production of Othello again. And so they cast the Othello, and they cast Desdemona. There were no women, so they cast another officer as Desdemona to play Desdemona. And he was kind of tall and broad-shouldered and stuff, so it wasn't thought that he was a good Desdemona. So they looked around for another officer, and they found one who was more slight and had more sort of gentle features and would be a better Desdemona. So the play went into rehearsals and such. But then, concepts of masculinity were shifting at this time, where this concept of masculinity, manliness, was starting to get defined in a more aggressive and sort of warlike or, martial way during this period. And so the officer playing Othello decided he didn't want this person playing, this other officer playing Desdemona, so they had to send to New Orleans to get an actress to come over and play Desdemona. But that person, the officer who was going to play Desdemona, was Ulysses S. Grant, which I thought was so interesting because I think of him, from the time when he's president, when he has that beard and stuff. He doesn't look like a Desdemona, but in his earlier days in like 1845, he did. So, what a great thing it would have been if he would have gone ahead and been able to play Desdemona. Apparently, he didn't have a problem at all with it. It was the Othello that had the problem with it. But concepts of masculinity, like I said, were changing at that time to the point that in Romeo and Juliet, the Romeo character was considered too unmanly for a male actor to play. So Romeo started getting played by female actors, which I thought was so surprising and interesting. Ultimately there was this actress, Charlotte Cushman, who apparently played Romeo so well, it caused its own sort of gender confusion with like, if a woman can play a man this well, what does it mean for masculinity, But I just thought that was fascinating. Ultimately, this period only lasted, I think the last time women played Romeo, I think after the Civil War, this all changed and men went back to playing Romeo. But nevertheless, I thought that was so interesting and cool. Okay, so Chapter 3, Class Warfare from 1849. All right, so there's this feud between an American Shakespearean actor and a British actor. The American actor is called Forrest, and I think the British one is Macready. Nevertheless, this occurs frequently through the book, where there's these differences there's these interaction between the U.S. and Great Britain all the time around. There's trading actors, and who's successful in the U.S. goes to Great Britain to play, and who's successful in Great Britain ultimately will do a U.S. tour. So there's this interchange going on all the time. But these two, it became a class issue. So the class system of the Great Britain was rejected completely by the Americans, and this really came to a head here in this chapter. Ultimately, there were these Shakespeare productions going on. This actor Macready was doing a U.S. tour and in New York, and there was also another sort of thing that added to the mix was that there's this opera house had been built that you couldn't get into unless you wore certain clothes, and it was more expensive, and so not everybody could go to that opera house. And so this caused a lot of problems because historically in the US, the plays were open to anyone. So there was no dress code or anything like that. There were cheap seats, there were super cheap seats, and then there were the boxes, where the wealthy sat. But they all saw the play together. And this was not the case. And this, to me, it reminded me of sort of the system we have now, right? Where it's expensive to go to a play. So not everyone has access to this anymore. So just like this era, right? But there was actually a full-on riot in New York over this whole thing. And this was whipped up partially by the American Shakespearean actor Forrest in opposition to this British one. So that was sort of fascinating to read. Then chapter 4, 1865, Abraham Lincoln. This is all about his assassination. Abraham Lincoln did not read novels, but he read some of the Shakespeare plays all the time, and he carried around copies of them. But so also his assassination, John Wilkes Booth was an actor, and he considered himself Brutus from Julius Caesar, killing off a tyrant. He did not think that the re-election of Lincoln was legitimate. He thought there had been fraud and that he was actually a hero because he was assassinating a tyrant. Ultimately, though, Lincoln, when he died in his orations and all around the country, the play that Americans turned to at that time was Macbeth, not Julius Caesar. Okay, so chapter 5 is called 1916 Immigration. This is all about the Tempest. So the Tempest, this is after Darwin's theory of evolution, and Caliban is this sort of person that's on the island in the Tempest, and he's sort of seen as sort of the missing link, right? Like a pre-human, like not quite human and not fully human. And so this is used then to sort of exemplify non-Anglo-Saxon white people and why they can't be allowed into the country. And there's even a quote about building a wall. Anglo-Saxons have the right to build a wall around themselves. There's a quote in the book about to keep out, to preserve this Anglo-Saxonishness, instead of allowing, at that point, the problem immigrants were Chinese, Eastern Europeans, and Southern Europeans like Greeks and Italians. So I thought that was really interesting. Okay, chapter 6, 1948, Marriage. This is all about the taming of the shrew, which is a more disturbing play than I actually realized. I've seen this play, but I didn't really click with me that that's kind of like an issue. So this is where a husband sort of dominates, needs to bring his wife into submission. And this is also about the production of Kiss Me Kate on Broadway, the musical, how it started out in one way in the 1940s, and by the early 1950s it had changed, and they had taken away a lot of the original sort of stuff that was in the play. And I thought that was super interesting. And then chapter 7, 1998, this is the Bill Clinton era of his affair he had. So adultery is an issue, but this is all about the production of the film Shakespeare in Love. So in the original screenplay, which started way back in the early 90s, Shakespeare, so the female character, who I can't remember her name, but so Shakespeare, there's a female character who dresses up like a boy so she can be in the play, because at that time no women could be in plays. And so Shakespeare falls in love with her/him and has this sort of crisis of identity, right? This sort of, and he contemplates, well, I love him, so regardless, in the original version. And, so he just comes to terms with it and say, well, I love him, so whatever. And then so eventually he finds out she is a female, but she asks him at some point, like, would you have still loved me as a boy or a man? And he said, yeah. So that sort of thing, I would have loved you as a man or a woman. So it didn't matter. He just loved her or him. So that was so interesting to me because I had no idea. Because of course the play went through multiple revisions, and ultimately the version that came out in 1998 did not contain this. So finally, in the conclusion, we talk again about the production in New York City of the Julius Caesar in 2017 and how much commotion this caused. This caused outrage among the right wing in the US. It was all over the news. There were disruptors that went to the plays. They were never able to shut the play down. They did manage to get some of the corporate sponsors to drop the play. Like I think Delta Airlines dropped the play as a sponsor because of the controversy, but they weren't ever able to shut it down completely, but they had to have very tight security. The interesting thing here I thought was that in 2012 there had been a production of this Julius Caesar where Obama was Julius Caesar, and it did not cause any commotion at the time. In fact, it was kind of a celebrated production that went on tour. Okay, I have gone over, but there was just so much to talk about in this book, so I wanted to kind of do it justice. But my next chat is going to be a Grail story, War in Heaven by Charles Williams. So until next time, take care. Bye.